I stared at my phone, rereading Mark's text for the third time. She's crazy. She hasn't loved me in years. I'm only staying for the kids. The words were like a salve, soothing the ache of guilt that had been gnawing at me for weeks. I wanted to believe him. No, I needed to believe him. It made everything we were doing feel justified, even right. Mark had told me so many times how trapped he felt in his marriage, how Emily was cold, ungrateful, impossible to please. He said she was manipulative, that she didn't understand him, didn't appreciate the man he was. I drank in his words like a lifeline. He made me feel wanted, cherished, alive. How could I be the bad guy if I was the one saving him from a life of misery? But in the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, a tiny voice whispered doubts. What if he wasn't telling me the whole story? I silenced that voice every time. I didn't want to think about Emily, about the woman who had once been in my place. But every so often, she would slip into my mind unbidden. Did she know? Did she suspect? I pictured her as Mark described, volatile, bitter, a shell of the woman he said he had fallen out of love with years ago. It wasn't hard to hate someone I'd never met when the version of her I carried in my head was painted by his hand. Still, there were cracks in his narrative I chose not to see. Emily's name came up in conversation often enough. Mark would roll his eyes whenever she texted about something ridiculous, like their kids' doctor's appointments or needing him to pick up groceries. He made it sound like she was a burden, dragging him down. But what Mark didn't tell me, what I didn't want to imagine, was Emily's side of the story. She was exhausted. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from years of raising children who need more than she can give. Both of their kids had medical conditions, and Emily had been the one staying up all night, driving to specialists and managing the chaos alone while Mark worked late or needed space. I didn't know that Emily had begged him to go to therapy, to talk about their problems, to save their marriage. I didn't know that she'd shown up to those sessions alone when he brushed her off, claiming her mood swings were the real problem. I didn't know about the lipstick stains she'd found on his shirt or the texts she'd discovered late one night, the ones I'd sent. When Mark finally told me he was kicking Emily out of the house so we could be together, I felt vindicated. He chose me, I told myself. It wasn't my fault if she couldn't keep him happy. I even felt a little smug, imagining her reaction when she realized she'd lost him for good. I ignored the little voice again, the one that wondered what her children would think when their dad moved someone else in. The one that whispered, if he could do this to her, what makes you so different? But I never let those thoughts linger for long. Mark made it easy to push them away. He'd wrap me in his arms, tell me how much better things would be now, how much happier he was with me, and I'd believe him. For a while. It was a few months after we moved in together that the cracks became harder to ignore. The first time I heard him yelling at his kids on the phone, I froze. His tone was sharp, cutting, nothing like the sweet, tender man I'd fallen for. He hung up and muttered something about how ungrateful they were, just like their mother. I laughed nervously, brushing it off. But the pit in my stomach grew. Then came the fights, small at first. He didn't like how I folded his shirts or how I left dishes in the sink. But they escalated quickly. He'd get this cold, detached look in his eyes, the same one I imagined he used with Emily. The worst part? I started to see myself in her. One night, I was scrolling through old photos on Mark's phone, pictures of his kids, vacations, birthdays, and then I found it, a picture of Emily. She was holding their youngest, smiling despite the exhaustion etched into her face. She looked nothing like the monster he had described. In that moment, it hit me. He had rewritten their story, twisting her into a villain so I could play the role of the hero. And I had let him. I hadn't saved Mark from a loveless marriage. I'd simply taken her place. Suddenly, the shine of our romance dulled. The man I thought I knew, the man I had built my dreams around, wasn't my knight in shining armor. He was the same man who had rewritten his history to justify leaving his wife, and he could just as easily do it to me. Because the thing about men, Mark, is that they're always the hero of their own story, even when it's someone else who pays the price.